Hi, everyone. While Catherine's getting ready, I'd like to give you my welcome to the, excuse me, to the curriculum. And I can start with the land acknowledgement unless there's somebody else that would like to do it. No? Okay, well, we'd like to welcome everyone. I am in Wikagna, the place of thorns, ancestral home of the people that are now known as the Bernandeño Tataviam band of Indians. We acknowledge all of our neighbors to the north, the Chumash to the south, Luiseño on the other side of the mountain, Serrano and Quitanamuk, and in the Los Angeles basin, the Tongva, Cabriolino, Quiche people. We have this plant knowledge based on indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. I'm trying to catch my breath. So in their honor, we go on with the class. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. And hello, everybody. I'm glad to see you all again. Oh, we already have like a jillion chat things. Everyone checking in. I appreciate that. If you can also make sure if your name on your little video screen is not your actual name, if you're using somebody else's laptop or computer, or if they're just initials or something like that, if you can rename yourself, just kind of like hover over your little window, click the little box at the right corner, and then press rename, and then rename yourself. That way we can take appropriate roll call. Thank you all for those of you who are also announcing yourselves in the chat. I think as long as you put your name in the window and you're not multiple people, if you're multiple people sharing one class, then add yourselves into the chat just so that we know, or let us know in some other way that multiple people are using the same computer. Otherwise, let us begin. This is going to be a pretty full content class, and it's mostly going to be pictures, which is wonderful. We're going to be going through a lot of the California native plants that you could and would encounter in the industry, some of the more common species, a few that are a little less common, and kind of talk about plant identification. And so that is going to be our goal today. Workshop plant ID, that's what we're doing. Okay, so identify more than 24 California native species, as well as non-native plants that some people mistake as California native plants. So that's gonna kind of be our goal today. And so to kick it off, I actually did want to review our homework assignment that we did, kind of to start the conversation. And to do that, I'm actually going to stop the share, or a new share. Ooh, new share is an option. I took some photos from your photos, or I took the photos that you did and put them all together. Not all of them. I took kind of like one from each student. My apologies for those of you who sent me your homework assignment in the last few hours. I did not include those, even though George, your photos of the California fan palms at California Botanic Garden was absolutely stunning. I wish I kind of waited to do this a little bit later so that I could have included those. But these are some of the photos that you guys submitted. So we had even potted plants from Theodore Payne. We have apricot mallow. We have the lemonade berry. And you guys can see this, correct? Just like nod, a few of you. Okay, good. I'm looking at you, Jack. Thank you. Let me view it bigger. No, yeah, sure. Okay, so you may see some of your photos in here. We have an annual Arroyo lupine in this here. We have the beautiful California sagebrush here, very aromatic. So if ever you go hiking and you rub up against this plant, you can definitely identify it just from the scent. We've got a coyote brush with a fantastic Tree People bucket in the back, or some kind of bucket in the back, in bloom. So this is something that blooms late in the season. We have somebody who has a Vermontodendron on their property, which is very impressive. It's not one of the ones that's easier to grow. So most of you guys either had these on your properties or you identified them in the wild, which was very cool. Monkey flower in somebody's property. This one is a bladder pod. Bladder pod is very interesting, versatile, also fragrant, not necessarily, some people say smelly. I'm gonna say fragrant plant with yellow flowers. We got the Channel Island bush poppy on the left, a toyon, beautiful toyon on the right, another apricot mallow, and this chalk dudleya on the right. So you guys sent some really, really great photos. Hummingbird sage on the left, a chamise, that's one of the key plants in the chaparral plant community. We've got California poppies on the left and a beautiful white sage here. And we got some cool, somebody even labeled this, we got Cleveland sage, and that is absolutely correct. And brittle bush, which you can see is just kind of like growing out the side of the road here at the reservation, I believe. And we've got yarrow as well. Another bladder pod. So I mentioned that other bladder pod. This is a big one. And then we have some cool questionable IDs. So a few people who questioned, is this, what is this? And so what this is baby oak tree. So this is a coast live oak seedling. We had two people, one who sent this photo of these seedlings. So this is a coast live oak seedling. Fantastic thing to find. Ideally would be in a location where it can grow into a big, beautiful tree. And on the left, one of the participants, and this is not to put anyone on the spot or to judge anyone, but this was something that was encountered hiking in Elysian Park. And so it was a question, is this a native plant or not? And so many of you have likely seen this plant when you go hiking. It's one of the most prevalent annuals that you will encounter. And despite the profusion of yellow blossoms and general prettiness, it is actually not a native plant and is considered an invasive species that actually causes significant harm to the ecosystem. So it becomes a pretty high fire hazard when it dries. It sends jillions of seeds, and so it usually crowds out, suffocates other native plants that are trying to get established. So the little oak tree on the right that you would see would have a very, very difficult time growing up through something like this. It would likely get outcompeted because of the aggressive quality. So when we say non-native doesn't always mean aggressive, but when it's a non-native and aggressive, then it can cause really significant harm, as is this particular plant. So this is either black mustard or Mediterranean mustard. Those are the ones you will see likely in Southern California. So those are thank you for sending that. That's a tricky one. And then we had two photos of this prickly pear. And then I shared this separately. This is not a photo that somebody sent. The one on the left is, I believe, native to Mexico. So it's not our native prickly pear, but it's going to be compatible in the sense that it's a very drought tolerant plant and is used a lot to, I believe this is the one, or it is very close to the one that is used for nopales or tunas, the actual fruit in a culinary sense. And then the one on the right is our native prickly pear. So this is coast prickly pear, Opuntia littoralis. It's related, but it's squatter, shorter, more sprawling, and thornier. But it has hugely valuable wildlife value. So it not only because of the fruit and flowers, but it protects a lot of birds and other animals who want to nest in it. Also kind of provides a barrier and protection for something like the little coast live oak that would want to come up, for instance. So there were a few other photos where non-native species were taken pictures of. And so one thing that I do want to make sure we're doing is understanding what a native species is as we move forward. Most of you were very aware already, but I do want to just kind of double check that we're on the same page. Okay, so California native plants are those that have existed here for millennia. We're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Prior to, and we use the kind of marker of time that we say something's native or not native, prior to European colonization of the continent. So that does not mean that native plants have never moved. That does not mean that native plants have never been traded, shifted, that the land was never managed. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that there are certain native plants that didn't cross oceans necessarily from Europe and Japan and China and wherever for a very, very long time. And then when Europeans came over, it brought over a whole new set of plants and animals and land management. And that has unfortunately pushed out and severely damaged the ecosystems here in the whole New World, I will say, but definitely in California, where we have such a rich kind of biological state. So you remember the photo that I shared of the, what was that? The biodiversity hotspot map. So that was in the last class. So think about how biodiverse, how rich, and then when other plants are coming in, sometimes they can coexist in a really compatible way. So we talk about California friendly plants, for instance, like that other Opuntia, the other cactus is a California friendly plant. But sometimes they come in and they actually take over. They create a harm by pushing out the native plants. So native plants are really, really essential because they and the wildlife evolved, and the geology of the state kind of all evolved together, and they kind of create this symbiotic relationship. So when you remove them, it affects so many other parts of the food web and also just human culture and all of that. So in particular, groupings of species who are adapted to particular conditions can be called a plant community. So they're working together, and plant communities are not, mute. There we go. So plant communities doesn't mean that it's completely rigid. Sometimes plant communities blend into others, but on the whole, if they have a particular kind of environment and the plants all grow together and the animals grow together, you can call that a plant community. So the coastal sage scrub plant community is a big one, and it's a really beautiful one. And so if you live in much of coastal Southern California, you've likely encountered a coastal sage scrub environment. So a lot of LA can be considered coastal sage scrub. And it's also referred to sometimes as soft chaparral. It's generally aromatic because of how much sagebrush grows in there. And the species that you can see, we have coyote brush and buckwheat, coast bush sunflower, which in the springtime, you'll see just a bunch of sunflowery type flowers throughout the hillsides. It's a lower growing composition of plants. You're not going to see big trees necessarily in this scenario. It's more kind of shrubby in a soft way. And the other thing about it that's significant is the closer to the coast it is, the more foggy it is. So a lot of these plants have actually adapted certain types of like leaf styles and sizes and shapes that hold on to fog and ambient air moisture. So they actually get quite a lot of their moisture from the air itself. So the next tier kind of above that I would say is like slightly harder, maybe slightly taller, a little bit more rigid. That's the chaparral. And so chaparral is the dominant community. Like if you ever were to go hiking in Griffith Park, for instance, that would be considered, more chaparral. Chamise is a dominant species in the chaparral. It's considered more flammable, and so that's one of the things that people associate with the chaparral is that many of the plants are adapted to fire. Either their seeds require fire in order to germinate, or they have strategies to be able to regrow after fire, which is really a good thing. And so it's a thick, dense type of kind of plant community. And when we say burns frequently, frequently, maybe like every 500 years, naturally maybe, the amount of frequency that we're seeing now is far more than some of these areas of chaparral can handle. Unfortunately, every time they do a gender reveal, they try to blow up the hillside and end up, causing wildfires.
Catherine, we're not seeing the PowerPoint. If we're supposed to be seeing it, we're not seeing it. We're still on the first slide.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Shoot. Okay. So let's try that again. I'm going to stop the share and restart and see if that helps. You know what? Hold on. Thank you for unmuting and sharing that. Oops.
While Catherine is figuring that out, a lot of plants, like she said, in the chaparral community are adapted to fire, and they either need the heat from the fire, nutrition from the ash, or what else do they need? The heat, the ash, or the smoke to reproduce. Coastal sage scrub, I think I put in the notes, it is also known as an elfin forest because instead of trees, you have big shrubs, but there is an understory and everything that you would have in a more traditional forest. We're back on, Catherine.
Okay, let me see. Well, I'm going to advance it forward and let me know if you can see it advancing. Can you?
Nothing changed.
Nothing changed?
No.
That's super weird. Okay.
That's really weird. I also put in the comments where you can find whose land you're on in case you're ever interested in doing a land acknowledgement. I don't know. When I co-host, I like to ask other people to, find whatever land they're on and do a land acknowledgement as well. Nothing changed. I didn't.
Okay, I'm gonna share. Okay. How about now? Wait a minute. Now?
Yes. Woo!
Okay, finally. All right. Forgive me, you guys.
You only get half of the slide, or that's me only. I get half the slide. Like the picture's cut off on the right side.
On the right side, the picture's cut off?
It might just be me.
I can see everything.
I can see everything.
Yeah, it's fine. Whoever said that, you just need to expand your window.
All right. Okay, cool. Thank you guys. I see there's like a jillion things in the chat, so it's probably like, Catherine, it's not moving. So my apologies for taking this long. So coastal sage scrub, here's an example of it, a picture of what I was discussing. And then the chaparral. So like I said, buckwheat, toyon, chamise, go hiking in Griffith Park, go hiking in certain areas like Eaton Canyon and such. You're going to encounter this this kind of vegetation. Oak woodland is really beautiful. So our kind of cornerstone tree in Southern California are the oak trees. And so you'll get southern oak woodland in this area. It's usually dominated by, oak trees, but also associated plant species and shrubs, and then also certain types of kind of grasses that are in between. And so generally oak woodlands are a little bit dense, and then it becomes kind of like oak savanna, and then eventually you just have like a grassland. But it is very iconic, and the oak trees, and we'll talk a little more about them, but they're some of the most important species for wildlife and support an insane quantity of animals as far as being a food source. And here you have grasslands. So one of the things about grasslands is most of the time, say you're driving up the 5 freeway and you see just rolling hills of grass. That's not a California grassland. That's a formerly excessively grazed cow pasture that has become dominated by European annual grasses. So that is the very unfortunate thing about native grasslands, is that they're almost nearly extinct at this point. Most of the California grasslands have perennial grasses with wildflowers, bulbs, and other things. So it's it's very, very kind of unique and special. And it's been for, several centuries probably grazed down to nothing and disturbed to a degree that they can't survive anymore, and the alien weeds and grasses and such have taken over. So it's a very unique, if you ever do end up in a kind of pristine California native grassland, you will be very, very lucky indeed. So the desert is another very, very beautiful environment. You have obviously things like the Joshua tree is kind of the iconic tree in a desert, but you have tons of wildflowers. So for any of you who are familiar with super blooms that kind of attractive quality of the desert will know that wildflowers are a pretty important feature of them. They're very seasonal and they're very weather dependent and rainfall dependent. So every now and then you'll get these high, wet kind of winter years in the desert, and then you'll end up with this incredible wildflower show. If you get like a so-so wet winter, maybe a few wildflowers. You get a very dry winter, you'll go out in the desert and you won't see very much. You'll still see things, but it's not going to be nearly like the super bloom. And I hope that if you ever do see a super bloom, that you're very respectful and you stay on the trails and you don't trample them or take Instagram photos laying in it and, putting a couch on it and taking a picture as your band cover. There's a lot of disrespect that happens during the super bloom, unfortunately. So I hope that if you do ever go there, you're very respectful, because this is another plant community that's under more and more threat as it becomes more and more popular. All right, riparian. So this one's interesting because most of the people associate California native plants with drought tolerant plants. So when we say California native, we mean it's from California. We don't necessarily imply that it's drought tolerant. However, much of the areas of California are low water or upland areas that don't get a lot of water, and that aspect of them is really applicable to most people's front yards, backyards, and kind of we want to generally promote more of that water-wise kind of landscaping. However, there are riparian zones in California. There are lakes and rivers and creeks and areas that do get inundated with water, whether seasonally or all the time. And so we do have species that survive and not only survive, but thrive in water or adjacent to water where their feet are always wet. So you have your willows generally in that environment. Your sycamores are actually a riparian tree. They can develop very deep roots. So sometimes they survive in scenarios that are not entirely riparian. But juncus is another type of, it's called rush. And ferns, we have monkey flowers. We have the water-loving monkey flowers as well as drought-tolerant version monkey flowers. And there again, wherever water is going to be a space where wildlife really, really depends on it as well. So it is a home to abundant diversity, and it does have some applications in a home environment if you have those scenarios where maybe water pools up or stays put, or you don't have really good drainage and some area floods. You can use riparian species, which is kind of fun. All right. So to start with actual plants, these are wildflowers, and some of these wildflowers are wildflowers you would see out in the desert, and some you would see more locally. They are annuals. So annuals mean they come up usually in the winter rain. There are some warm season annuals, but generally speaking, we have our annuals that come up because of winter rain. They grow their leaves out during the winter, and usually by spring, they're blooming their little heads off. And then by summer, they're drying up and they're forming their seeds. And then by end of summer, they're totally crunchy and dry, and you can rescatter their seeds. So they complete their entire life cycle in just one year or less than a year, really. And so we have a lupine on the left right here, and we have this local poppy. So this is a super local poppy that I think Theodore Payne even collected post-fire after the La Tuna Canyon fire and regenerated the seed. to try to kind of amplify the seed source of this, if I'm not mistaken. So this is actually very cool because it's very yellow, it's not orange. And it's almost, when it was in bloom, I felt like it was almost more beautiful than the desert orange poppy. All right, I'm gonna just check. Oh, Brenda's doing a good job. Okay, Brenda, I'm not gonna check the chat as long as you're here. All right, cool. So ground covers. So now we're gonna get into actual plant types and plants and things that you could use in landscapes and gardens, and or things for you to identify in landscapes and gardens. So ground covers will be obviously the low growing spreading shrubs. We don't have very many in the California native plant world, very many ground covers that will be walkable. So usually when we talk about ground covers, we're talking about plants that are shrubs that grow and spread down, but it's not one, like you can maybe step on it once accidentally, it's not a big deal, but it's not going to be like a lawn type ground cover. There's very few. So manzanitas are a shrub that come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but they also come in ground cover forms. Usually these ground covers are from northern coastal scenarios in California. You don't find Southern California manzanitas growing in this low habit. So this is a coastal species that has usually milder temperatures where it's native in California. They can sprawl out because they're not getting like super baked by the sun. It's foggy. Maybe it doesn't get more than 80 degrees at the hottest time of the year. And so they develop this kind of habit. We bring them to Southern California. When we plant them, we have to be aware of where they come from in California. These would be great, generally speaking, with a little bit more protection in Southern California. So instead of putting it in full sun in Southern California, like you might in Northern California, you put it in half sun, protect it from afternoon shade. But it's very, very beautiful when it's successful. And so definitely is worth trying, but keep in mind that they're a little more slow growing than some of your other options. So for instance, buckwheats. Buckwheats also come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Ground cover forms do exist. Generally, I think a buckwheat can take a little more sun than a ground cover manzanita, I would say. And there are lots of different types of cultivars. There's, what is it? Oh, my favorite, I will say, because it's a kind of a straight coastal species, but it's a taller ground cover, is Eriogonum cinereum, or ashy leaf buckwheat. So that one's like 3 feet tall, but it spreads to about 6 feet wide. It's very billowy and it's like a big gray cloud with little light pink flowers on it. So this one's and just a huge magnet for wildlife. So buckwheats are those species of plants that attract tons of pollinators. So anytime somebody says, I want a butterfly garden, I want a bee garden, I want something that's going to help the pollinators, you definitely want to put buckwheats in there. So there are really flat ground cover options like the words you see at the top, Bruce Dickinson, Theodore Payne is very flat. But Dana Point is more moundy, but very tight. And so these are just lots of different, like kind of more ground hugging options of buckwheats. Artemisia also comes in. So artemisias are sagebrushes. They also come in some ground cover forms. Same deal. Most of these ground cover forms come from coastal areas. So if you do a little bit of protection, that's usually a good idea. I have seen this one, Artemisia pycnocephala, in the wild at, I believe it was Moss Landing State Beach, literally on the dunes, and where everywhere else, maybe like 5 miles away, it was 95 degrees. In this place, it was 58 degrees, foggy, so incredibly like another planet. And these guys were growing in there. They're also in the nursery trade and have been planted in Southern California, and they get very tight and bally, and they're not quite like that in their natural habitat. So you'll see that when you plant some things, even in California, something's California native, keep in mind where it comes from in California and make sure you're making certain adjustments for that. So for instance, for this one, I would put it in a morning sun, afternoon shade scenario against an east-facing wall, maybe on the east facing side of a tree or something like that. So give it a little more protection. And generally ground covers can take a little more or prefer a little more protection, except for this guy. So this is coyote brush. Coyote brush is one, I would say, major exception in that it can take anything. I will say, I mean, I don't want to be completely exaggerating, but it can take very, very harsh sun scenarios. It is another coastal form, and it grows much flatter to the ground and spreads a little wider in coastal scenarios. And it gets a little bit tighter and like a little more self-protective when it's being beaten down by the sun, but it can handle it. It can handle very harsh situations. So ground cover coyote brushes are probably my top pick if I had to only plant one native ground cover and I had to cross out all the other ones and say, this is the only one I'm ever going to plant. It would be ground cover coyote brush. Pigeon Point being one of the most common cultivars. Twin Peaks number 2 is another cultivar of that. And then San Bruno Lady is another one. Coyote brush is interesting because it's it has male or female plants. And so the male flowers are different than the female flowers. So if you see kind of what looks like little cottony tufts on the plant, that's a female. The male flowers are just kind of like a pale cream colored, but it doesn't have any of that kind of fluff on it. I actually like the fluff because it kind of happens close-ish to the holidays and it sometimes looks like snow. But this is an excellent one. I would say a guaranteed necessary plant for kind of urban gardens. One thing I will say though, I did see somebody plant them just recently. I was driving through Glendale and somebody had planted them. Number one, they planted them on the parkway. They planted them a foot apart from one another. So every 1 foot was one of these plants. One of these plants gets 6 to 8 feet wide. So please give them the space to get as big as they can without climbing onto a neighbor after a foot of growth. The other thing I noticed is that they didn't follow up with any kind of maintenance. And so as the plants were growing in, so did all of the crabgrass come right back from the lawn removal, and the crabgrass was just growing through it. So please keep in mind, these are ground covers, but they're not necessarily going to make it a maintenance-free garden for you. You're still going to have to pay attention and be weeding and making sure they're set up for success. Next ground cover options are the Ceanothus, very popular ground covers. I would say Yankee Point is probably the most widespread and the most used and the most common. And Joyce Coulter, I would say, is more of my favorite, more than Yankee Point myself. But they can form pretty wide, kind of moundy ground covers. They do have some that are flatter and shorter to the ground, but they have, again, a harder time handling the harsher afternoon sun. So the ones that are a little bit tougher, I would say, are Joyce Coulter and Yankee Point as far as their ability to handle harsher scenarios. So like it says here, don't plant them too close to each other because they're going to spread. Yankee Point can spread easily to 8 feet, and Joyce Coulter as well. So don't plant them too close to each other, and be aware that Ceanothus tend to be a little bit more touchy when it comes to summer irrigation. So ground cover sages are another tougher of the ground covers. I would say tougher than a manzanita ground cover potentially. But they can go somewhat semi-dormant if they're in a hot sun environment. One that I think is a stellar one is Salvia Bee's Bliss. That's the picture on the left. That one's really tough, can handle lots of harsh conditions, but by late summer doesn't look too hot. The coyote brush definitely looks better year round compared to the Salvia Bee's Bliss, but doesn't have nearly as pretty flowers. So you can see this one is in bloom, which is really, really nice, and is definitely sun tolerant. Another one that's a black sage cultivar called Terra Seca. That one's also very tough for harsher environments. There's some that are planted in Theodore Payne's grounds that just take a beating with the sun, and they're very, very dense and beautiful.
Catherine, for some of the students that don't know, can you please explain what a cultivar is and
Yes.
what we have when we have like Salvia Appiana and Salvia Appiana El Dorado? What does that mean?
Yes. So for those of you who are unaware of what it means when we call something a cultivar means that it's a selection. So if I am a horticulturist and I'm going out, say I'm in the wild and I see, hey, this black sage, which normally has white flowers, this one has blue flowers. I want to be able to have more of these that have this unique characteristic. Or say you go through something like, hey, I'm seeing a coyote brush that's normally really tall and this one's really flat. I want to introduce that into the nursery trade. So what these people have done is they've taken cuttings, clones, basically taken clones of these plants and grew them out and then planted them out and then take more cuttings and then offer these plants for like introduce them into the nursery trade. So a cultivar is a selection. Anytime you see that single quotes with a name, that is a selected form of that species. So Salvia bee's bliss is a selected form of sage. Every single Salvia bee's bliss is the same 100% genetically a clone of every other Salvia bee's bliss. So you know that it's going to behave the same way, it's going to look roughly the same with some variations, obviously based on the garden environment, but you know that kind of genetically it's the same plant. So why is this good and why is this bad? This is good because it gives you reliable characteristics that don't have kind of natural species kind of variation. If you want something that gets 6 feet wide and you plant this thing that you know is going to get 6 feet wide and isn't going to necessarily throw you off, that's helpful for garden planning, and it's helpful also just for aesthetics, like, oh, I really like white flowers and this plant usually has pink flowers, but this form has white flowers, so now I have this option of planting this. But what's bad about that, or what can be, you know, maybe a criticism of that, is that they're all clones of each other. So they're all genetically identical, which reduces the amount of genetic diversity in the kind of plant world. And so what's really important for kind of resilience, ultimately, big picture, as we're in a uncertain climatic future, is for plants to have as much genetic diversity as possible. And so to have a majority of plants be, say, cultivars or clone, it kind of reduces that ability for plants to be able to kind of face an uncertain future. Because when you have a lot of genetic diversity, there's going to be some plants that can handle, you know, maybe intense heat, and some plants that are a little less tolerant, but they can maybe handle more water and they can handle such and such. So having lots of different kind of variations is actually very helpful in being able to kind of like evolve. It's an evolutionary strategy. So that's something that you should keep in mind. My tendency and my preference is to pick non-cultivars and seed-grown non-cultivars that are locally sourced. So the Theodore Payne Foundation actually has a local source initiative where they grow plants from locally sourced seeds. They're not cultivars, they're the local, you know, natural plants in kind of the local wilderness areas. And so those are the most attractive for me personally. But cultivars in a garden setting, sometimes, you know, you have to have something that's 2 feet tall, and maybe there's no straight species that's going to give you the look you have. That's why I kept kind of gushing over the pigeon point coyote brush, because it's one of those that is so applicable in so many scenarios, especially in the urban setting. All right, so now we're going to get into slightly bigger plants. So we already talked about manzanita ground covers. Now we're talking about manzanita shrubs. There are so many. Between manzanitas and ceanothus, these are some that have become the most popular as far as introducing new cultivars and species and such into the trade. So generally speaking, manzanitas require a good drainage for the most part. and they're quite intolerant of heavy summer irrigation after they're established. So some people have a hard time with manzanitas, but when they're successful, they're very, very rewarding to have. Them and the ceanothus are winter and early spring bloomers. So that's something that brings you flowers in January. And that's going to support, you know, hummingbirds and bees in January. That's a really good thing. And it's good to have different things blooming at different times of the year. This one is Canyon Sparkles. So that one's called, and the people who name them are the people usually who introduce them. You're technically, there's a little rule that you're not supposed to name it after yourself. And so they come up with all sorts of names. If it is a named one, it's usually named in honor of somebody else. So if you hear like Ian Bush Manzanita or whatever, it's usually in honor of somebody else. It's not the person who's actually introduced it. All right, so California lilacs. The flowers range anywhere from white to purple to blue, like almost cobalt blue, depending on the species. Also sensitive to summer water, but these ones are ones that almost everybody appreciates and loves and is interested in. Even people who don't like native gardens, who are a little bit more conventionally minded as far as gardens, can see how gorgeous and incredible these plants are and usually want them. And then unless you understand their habit and their preferences, sometimes they end up causing trouble later on, in the sense that you've watered them too heavily in the summer and then they die and then people get sad. And so just be careful about summer watering on these guys. And one thing that happens with this species that most people freak out about, unless you're just more familiar with them, is that the transition from spring to summer. This is for actually many species, but this one is most prominent as far as what it shows. The transition from spring to summer, you will see a lot of leaf drop. You will see a lot of yellowing leaves and dropping leaves. That's a natural sloughing off of the winter leaves of the ceanothus. Many shrubs do this. They have bigger, kind of rounder, floppier winter leaves, because that's when the rain happened. They flesh out, they send out their bigger leaves when there's not as much sunlight. And then once the sun gets harsh and the water gets pulled back, they drop those. They let them dry off on purpose, slough it off, and then they keep their summer leaves. Summer leaves are kind of smaller, tighter. And so in that transition from spring to summer, people go, my ceanothus is dying. And then they water it like crazy, thinking that it's dying when it's doing something very, very normal and natural. And then they kill their ceanothus, and it becomes this self-fulfilling kind of thing. They go, oh the leaves are yellowing. I watered it, but it was too late. It died. It died because you watered it. The yellowing leaves were normal. So keep that in mind with the ceanothus. Manzanita sometimes do that. Some of the other species can do that as well. That transition, spring to summer, normal sloughing. So this is a very unique, beautiful shrub. This is called a mountain mahogany. So you'll see this. There's quite a bit of it in Griffith Park. I'm going to reference Griffith Park a lot just because that's where I hike the most. But you'll see this all over. The very beautiful thing about this, and I kind of wish there was a photo of it, the seed heads on this plant are like little feathers. And if you plant it in a spot where it gets that golden late afternoon sun, the whole bush is like glowing. So this is a very interesting one if you have a design eye to put in a full sun environment, but definitely where it's going to get that late afternoon golden hour sunlight. Because when it has the seed heads on it, and it's practically silver and white and just glowing. So it's very, very cool. And this is a show-stopping favorite. We have bush sunflower, hugely valuable both for birds as well as pollinators. They will bloom for a very, very long time. And they do go summer dormant if you pull back on the water in the summer. Other people have said they just keep watering it and it keeps blooming. Eventually, if you do that too much, you can just kill it or just make it have a really short lifespan. So it doesn't typically live that long anyway, like 3 to 5 years is pretty normal. But I think if you just kept watering it and it kept expending energy flowering, you definitely maybe get 2-3 years out of it rather than something a little bit more long term. So just keep that in mind. Know that if it looks like it's dying, it's not dying. You can trim it back and it'll come back next year. And buckwheat. So we talked about ground cover buckwheats. Now we're going to talk about the regular non-ground cover buckwheats. And so far in this photo, this is red flowering buckwheat. This is actually red flowering buckwheat from buckwheats that I grew from seed, collected directly off of Santa Rosa Island. And so these are as close to the islands as you can get. So the Channel Islands are considered part of our kind of California floristic province, part of the California native plant palette. And this is one island species that's very compatible in the kind of Southern California garden because it tends to be small. It tends to have obviously very showy flowers, as you can see. And so it just makes a very good kind of perennial, smaller perennial garden kind of a look. It's good if you want to mimic even like a little cottage garden or an English garden or anything like that. So it has a good habit for all of that. Keep in mind, these will die. The stalks will turn, kind of a brown, and then you'll want to cut them off and just leave the foliage. And the plant on the right here is a hybrid between, I believe it's the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat and the St. Catharines Lace buckwheat, I think. And so it's got these really big, almost little umbrella-like flowers. And it's really, really slightly smaller than the St. Catharines Lace, but bigger than the Santa Cruz Island. But generally speaking, on the whole, buckwheats are going to be your prime pollinator support, habitat support kind of shrubs. So I think they're essential in every single garden, unless you have a total shade garden, because they don't quite work in the shade. But any plant where you have an opportunity, or any garden where you have an opportunity for full sun scenario or half sun scenario, a buckwheat would work and would majorly add to the habitat value of the space. So I highly encourage these to be planted everywhere. If you can only plant one shrub in your whole life, one tree and one shrub. One tree would be an oak tree and one shrub would be a buckwheat. If you had to, I think if you planted those, you'd hit the most number of wildlife served and benefited. So gambelias. Gambelias are the snapdragon. We have the island snapdragon and the Baja snapdragon. So these will have tubular red flowers that are attractive to hummingbirds. What's nice about the island snapdragon is it has just this glossy, formalish looking foliage. It is a little more sprawling, however, in habit, but it works in those weird semi-shade environments that some other plants don't necessarily thrive in. This one always kind of just like brightens it up because it has that bright, almost limey green leaf. It's glossy-ish. And the flowers, it's not a heavy flower. I would say the Baja snapdragon, because it's in more sun, requires more sun, tends to bloom better. And they can take a little more water. I think both of these can take a little bit more water. All right. So this one, again, very key shrub in Southern California. This is toyon. Toyon, also sometimes called Christmas berry. The fable, I don't know, not fable, but the whole myth is that Hollywood was named after this shrub because it has almost a little holly-like leaf and it produces that little red berry. Turns out that's not true, but I like to say it because it makes it sound like a celebrity plant. And you can see it in Hollywood Hills. You see it all over Southern California. So the really nice thing about it is it has those white, creamy white flowers, which do not smell great. They don't smell bad. You won't notice them unless you're like put your face in it. But the flowers are majorly important for lots of insects, lots of little pollinators. And then the seeds happen in the middle of winter. So when all the other plant life is maybe still dormant or just barely coming out of dormancy after the rains, this one is actually in full fruit. And so lots of bird species rely on it during a time of year that's hard for them to get other kinds of food. So it's really an important wildlife plant. The other benefit is, again, also semi-glossy leaves, green, evergreen, clean, easy to prune, generally no fuss, a little more adaptable as far as water needs. You can rot it like anything else, but it's not as touchy as a manzanita or a ceanothus. So it's just got a general really good adaptable quality to it. The other thing that's really adaptable about it, it can take full hot sun, or it can take a significant amount of shade. So you can do it in any scenario. Just expect the plant in full sun is going to grow faster, generally speaking, than the one in the shade. So, but aside from that, it can take either scenario. So another really nice shrub are the native cherries. So just like cherry trees, we have our native version of cherries. And so there's island cherries, and then there's the mainland version of that. The island ones have a little bit bigger leaves, a little more glossy. The tree itself is a little bigger, and the fruit itself is a little bigger. But it doesn't quite handle the harsher conditions as well as the mainland ones. So the Prunus ilicifolia is kind of my preference versus the Ilicifolia leonii or leoni. But I think this might just have Ilicifolia, these photos. So really nice evergreen, doesn't go dormant. So when people say, oh, native plants all go dormant, yeah, if you're only planting like maybe perennials and such, you have a lot of that summer dormant quality. But when you get your toyons, when you get your prunus, when you have your mountain mahoganies, you have all these kind of the bones of your garden, basically. These are these everlasting evergreen species that tend to look good year round and have, as you can see, visual interest at different times of the year, whether it's fruit or berries or flowers or just the really attractive leaves. So the Rus genus has lots of different, just a few different evergreen, again, clean evergreen shrubs. One of my favorites is lemonade berry, sugar bush is another. And then this one is an interesting one. This is called Rus lenti, or pink flowering sumac. So I believe this might be it's either from Baja or from the Channel Islands. I don't quite remember. But it's another one that's very, very cool and unique and attractive. And they get big, so these are large shrubs to form, like I said, the kind of bones. They can also be informal hedges. And then after I finish through the shrubs, I'll check the chat. I see there are a few things in the chat in case you guys have some questions, and then we'll take a little break. And then we'll do the rest of the plants, because I know this is just a lot of plants on plants. So the next group of shrubs is ribes. Ribes is the genus for the currants and the gooseberries. So currants can be differentiated from gooseberries because the gooseberries have the most wicked thorns on them, and the currants do not. This golden currant is the featured photo. It blooms in the winter. It has fruit. It actually has edible currants. Not going to ever be in enough profusion for you to make a pie out of it. And if you were to do that, you would just be taking all the currants from birds, because that's who really wants to eat them. And they tend to eat them before they get ripe. And so then you miss your window anyhow. But if you want something that does, again, pollinator habitat, hummingbirds really like these flowers, and then the berries in the spring. And then by summer, they start to go dormant. So this is another species that has that summer dormancy. The only one that doesn't is the evergreen currant, and that's a ground cover, shade-loving currant from Catalina, I believe. and Vermontodendron. So we had somebody who, as part of their homework assignment, submitted a picture of Vermontodendron. So this is one cultivar called Ken Taylor. The reason why this was selected as a cultivar is because of this kind of mounding, sprawling habit. Most Vermontodendrons grow really big and tall, like 8 feet, 10 feet, sometimes 15 feet. So this kind of mounding, ground covery form became very attractive to whoever was the horticulturist who came up with, or I would say it's Ken Taylor, but he wasn't technically allowed to name it after himself, so maybe it's somebody else. And so I don't have the history on that, but I do know that this, the genus, the Vermontodendrons in general, are much like Manzanitas, much like Ceanothus, touchy with summer water. Their roots are a little bit more sensitive. And their leaves themselves have hairs on them that can create a little bit of contact dermatitis. So they have some irritating hairs on it. Why do people plant them? Well, look at these incredible flowers. That's why. So they're very attractive, very showy. You know, obviously wildlife benefits from the flowers. And so this is another really drought tolerant shrub as well. So it does need good drainage. This is one that you're not really going to plant in clay or heavy soil. And so some people even say to plant it up on a mound. I don't know how high a mound would be reasonable, but I do, you know, recommend not even maybe attempting them if you know you have heavy clay. And one of the recommendations is don't plant them near a pathway, nowhere where somebody's going to just like brush up against it all the time. And when you do prune it, or if you do prune it, to make sure that you're wearing, you know, long sleeves and gloves and everything, and that you're kind of cleaning up after. All right, so now we're at the perennials. So I'm going to check the chat since we're going from shrubs to perennials. Okay. Red flower buckwheats from the Channel Islands. Yes, there's also Eriogonum grande, or Eriogonum grande, and that buckwheat is also from the Channel Islands and is bigger. So you have the grande var, VAR usually means variety, VAR rubescens, so that's the red buckwheat. The Eriogonum grande var grande is a much bigger and taller, and usually has white, kind of creamy white flowers, but has a similar kind of look and habit. Many of the plants that are being passed off, not passed off, but sold as Eriogonum grande rubescens, or the red buckwheat, are actually hybridized with grande, so they actually are much bigger. And the flowers are much paler, not quite as dark pink as you saw in the photo. And so that was one of the reasons why I grew that species, because I wanted the exact one from the exact island that didn't have any kind of hybridization. And so they were planted at Theodore Payne, and they're all next to one another, so they're only cross-pollinating with each other. And so then you're going to get a much more pure seed for that species. So next in the chat. How far apart? You guys are answering each other's questions. I love that. I don't know what the reference is to how far apart, but generally with any plant, you want to make sure that you're planting for mature size. So if they get 3 feet wide, you want to plant them on 3 foot centers. So every 3 feet you can plant a plant. You just have to make sure, you know, each plant can grow 1.5 feet to one side and 1.5 feet to the other side without bumping into each other. And so that's basically what you want to do. George said he saw Toyon at Springs Preserves in Vegas as an understory. So yeah, you could, Vegas is hotter than here. So if you put anything that, you know, normally takes milder conditions and put it in a harsher scenario, then definitely shading it is kind of the way to accommodate for them for that. All right, so let's take a 5-ish minute. Let's see what time it is right now. Yeah, it's 7 o'clock. We're good. Okay, so let's take a 5 to 10 minute. Let's do a 10-minute break. Get yourself some coffee, tea, take a break, go to the bathroom, stretch, do some yoga, we'll come right back here at 7:10-ish. So go do your thing. If anybody has questions in the chat, they can ask me until I do go to the bathroom, and then you can't. Can we get copies of your PowerPoint? Alexis is asking. You will be receiving a recording of each class after the fact. So it won't be the PowerPoint document itself, but you're going to receive hopefully a YouTube link to the class. And if not a YouTube link, I think the first thing they were doing is sending like a Google actual file for you to watch. But for people who don't have kind of Gmail accounts, they want to make sure to get it on YouTube as well. So keep an eye out for that. You'll be able to see the recording for all of the classes. Oh, thank you, Charles. I appreciate that. I'm all for plant-specific tips. Yeah, I'm generally just talking about what I know and not actually reading what's on the slide. So I think I should do both. And the other thing too is if you guys attend the in-person workshops, that's a real good opportunity to ask a lot of these kinds of questions as well. It's my favorite form of classes is in person. It's not doing online. It makes a big difference to see something in person, and just to be around people physically is much more engaging. So if there's anything that you feel is lacking in the virtual format and you want me to maybe re-emphasize or talk about or bring back a topic or something like that, and we can do that in person, please feel free to make a note. We're not sticking to any particular type of script during the workshop. It is going to be an irrigation workshop and then a pruning workshop, but we can cover lots of different topics during that time. So am I going to the workshop as well? Or are you going as well? I'm definitely going to the workshop. I'm going to be leading the workshop. So I hope I'll be going. And the workshops will be held at Tree People. So for those of you who have not been to the Tree People headquarters, that's a great opportunity just to go there and maybe make some extra time. It's only like an hour and a half workshop. But you can, after the workshop, there's hiking trails and you can really kind of spend some time there. So definitely block out a bigger chunk of your calendar for that day. Somebody read somewhere to plant yarrow under citrus because the yarrow mines minerals in the soil and draws them up for the citrus. Do you know if that's true? I don't know if that's true. That could be entirely true. I'm just not familiar with that. Somebody did mention also that yarrow, gophers like yarrow. And so I find that, gophers generally also like kind of tap-rooted types of plants. And so yarrow, I think, might grow in that kind of manner underground. Gophers also are just pains. I planted 25 purple needlegrass plugs, and they just start pulling them down from underground. I didn't realize that in the cartoons, when they show the carrot just disappear, like just completely underground. That's an actual thing they do. They just pull it right in, and then there's just a hole. And I'm like, where did the plant? I know I planted something there. So they're fun. What do gophers not like? Yeah. Generally, I don't want to say they don't like sage, but I've seen sages be pretty safe from gophers. Euphorbias of all kinds, probably. Euphorbia generally are all toxic. So anything that's going to be toxic for sure. Anything that has like highly aromatic generally and things that have more of that like more fibrous roots and less of that tap-rooted quality. And then you can also use gopher baskets, or Jack in the group here recommended Volking kind of mesh, kind of gopher basket type netting that you can use. So that seems to be pretty successful out in the restoration sites. So that's an option. All right. I will be right back. Roots that are not one singular root, but more like a vine system of roots. Taproot is usually one big, like a carrot. Think of a carrot, the way that grows. So that's like a tap-rooted plant. And so that kind, and they still have like other roots that come off of that main taproot, but that's particularly delicious to gophers. Versus more fibrous roots that come out in like lots of different directions and don't have one main really thick kind of root that's the main system there. So that's what I mean. Yeah. All right, I will be right back, everyone. All right. Well, it is 7:10. So we are going to continue. So we've got perennials, grasses, kind of succulent cactus. We have a few other plant groups, and then we have a couple activities. So hopefully we can get to do those. And then I'll share your next homework assignment, which is a little more, not heavily involved, but it's a little more involved than the last one. All right, so perennials. So when we're talking about perennials, usually perennials are your floweriest plants. So this is what most people are most attracted to when they're thinking about designing their garden. The thing to keep in mind, the floweriest stuff tend to have the most prominent off season. So something that has the biggest blooms also looks the worst when the blooms are done. So don't use perennials as your only part of your garden or a client's garden. They should really be an essential part, but not necessarily the only part. So I talked about shrubs like the lemonade berry, like the toyon, like the hollyleaf cherry and such being your bones, or kind of the harder, more evergreen, more permanent qualities in the garden. So don't forget those as we go through these really pretty ones that I'm about to show you. So Achillea or yarrow is a perennial that has, again, super beneficial pollinator flowers. And so it spreads by rhizomes. So rhizomes are underground root structures that will kind of spread and pop up. They're actually underground stems, and then they pop up new plants in different places. So they'll continue to spread and creep and pop up in different areas. So some people, because of that, have used them as a lawn alternative. I have not seen a long-term successful yarrow lawn personally. So they have a hard time sometimes competing with other weeds, or you're always trying to pull the other weeds out. Or they can start becoming more dominant, like some of them form more dominant clumps while other ones kind of peter off. And so then you end up with a little bit more of a gappy lawn. So some people will say, I'm going to do a yarrow lawn. It works for a few years, and then it starts just becoming kind of a more informal meadow, which is fine, but it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to step on or use very easily. So moderate substitute for a lawn. So not a great substitute. So again, more aesthetically better. It's a good aesthetic lawn substitute. It's not a good functional lawn substitute. So you rarely get a native lawn substitute that you can play badminton on, or practice karate or whatever. The kind of use that a regular lawn gets is not going to be something that yarrow can handle. But you can mow it, and sometimes the mowing rejuvenates it in a way that encourages more spreading, which is cool. So mowing or coppicing is cutting all the way down to the ground, invigorates it. And Island Pink is a nice selection with these, I think it's meant to say flowers rather than fluorescent florals. But they have these really beautiful pink flowers. And normally the native yarrows are white or pink. Anytime you see the bright yellow or the maroon or any of those colors, they tend to be the non-native yarrow, but generally kind of fit in the same niche in a garden. So this one is a really special one because of the late blooming quality of it. The fuchsias bloom in the summer and the fall, depending on the species, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes pretty late. And sometimes it might still have blooms on it and it's December or January. So some of them could really last a long time and bring some color later on. One thing that does have to, it also spreads by rhizomes, similar to the fuchsia, but in a slightly similar to the yarrow. But one thing to keep in mind, this one has to be coppiced. After it blooms, pretty much at the New Year mark is when I do it. You want to cut it down to the ground to rejuvenate it. If you don't, it will push the next year's growth only on the ends of the branches, and you'll end up with this whole brown mess of tangly nonsense in the middle. And then it ends up just looking really mangy and unruly, and that's one of the things, and it also reduces the blooms. Not reduces, but doesn't really give as much potential for a really solid bloom the next year. So that coppicing really encourages tons of new, unique, fresh kind of stems that all kind of remain green longer. They don't have as much brown material, and then it blooms really heavily on that the following year. So definitely cut it back hard. They can take a little extra water. And how late, somebody asked, how late in the year can you coppice the fuchsia? You can coppice it, like I said, I usually use like New Year's as a marker, but what you want to consider is the weather and the season. When you start to see the winter rains, whatever the rainy season rain happens, it will start to push some new growth. The second you start to see it pushing the new fresh leaves, that's when you know you need to coppice it. So just do it either right before that time or right after that time. If it's pushed a ton of growth out already, it's expended all of this energy, it's April or something like that, and then you coppice it, then you're going to deplete it. It just spent all this energy and now it has to regrow all from scratch again. So you don't want to, in that scenario, say you accidentally couldn't reach the right time, just let it be for another year. Let it photosynthesize, let it get more energy, do it right the next year. But usually, you know, December, January is a good time. February, you can sometimes do that too. Oh, and yes, and Evan asks, do we wait a year or two after the initial planting for it to establish before cutting? And yes, you wait 1 year, or give it a full year cycle. You don't want a very baby plant who's just barely, you know, learning to live. You don't want to cut that down to the ground. So give it like a year, for like a full year's growth at least, or a year and a half or so, before you start doing that coppicing. And when you say how much to cut, you want to cut it very low. I mean, just a few inches off the ground. If it's already a really mature plant and it's got lots of rhizomes and there's just stems coming up from all over the ground, you can like mow it down all the way to the ground, and it, frankly, you could probably rip it out of the ground and it would still come back. So when they're happy, they're really, really robust and easy. Like you can cut it very, very hard. But when they're not established yet, sometimes they're touchier, sometimes they're a little bit more like tender. And so let it get to the point where it's starting to do a little bit more of that rhizome activity, and it had a full year to kind of establish before you start whacking it down to nothing. But it does really well in full sun. You could put it in some shade, but the blooms will be better in full sun. All right, so Erigeron. And yes, there are many cultivars of California fuchsia, somebody asked. Some of them grow taller, some of them grow lower, some of them are from more mild temperatures, some are from harsher temperatures. So I think one of the most stellar cultivars is probably one from the islands called Catalina. It's the tallest one with a very red and longer than usual kind of red flower. But the one that I plant time and time again, because it's my preference, is not a cultivar at all, but the species of hoary fuchsia, Hoary fuchsia, and that is Epilobium canum canum, or subspecies canum, and that's the local one that I know grows here in Griffith Park. So that's the one that I see growing off the cliffside in decomposed granite, and that's the one that's my personal preference. All right, so this is Erigeron. Erigeron are the seaside daisies. Seaside daisy flowers are aster flowers. So asters are a whole family of plants. There's just like a jillion of them. And this is a very typical aster looking flower. So somebody who just asked that, it's very similar, and they're all asters technically, but this is not the common name of aster. This is a common name of seaside daisy. So seaside daisies are from the coast. They're extremely charming. If you live on the west side, if you live in a coastal climate, they're fantastic in gardens. They're really good in containers as well. There's one cultivar that is not as coastal conditions requiring, and that is Erigeron WR. And that is listed right in the middle of this paragraph here. So Erigeron WR can take a little harsher conditions. It can take more sun. It can take. They can all take more water, and probably would bloom better with a little more water than your typical super drought tolerant yard. But that one is a little bit better for, I would say, Southern California non-coastal gardens, more inland gardens. And they're small, they're cute, they're perennials. You know, they form kind of these mounds, and just kind of show off with all of these flowers, which you have to deadhead eventually. And there is a Grateful Dead reference that I didn't know, and I had to ask about it, why it says Go Jerry at the bottom here. So it appreciates being deadheaded. So anyone who likes the Grateful Dead will laugh at this. Anyone who doesn't know will feel silly like I did when I had to ask, why does it say Go Jerry? And so this is, again, charming garden perennial, better for coastal conditions unless you're planting WR. All right, fan favorite, and one of my favorites are the penstemons. So penstemons are also have a lot of different cultivars and species. One of my favorite ones is a local species that you see in the picture right ahead of you is Penstemon spectabilis, or showy penstemon. So these will get easily 3 foot, maybe 4 feet high with the flowers. They can get 3 to 4 feet wide. They're green perennials that in the springtime shoot up these long flower stalks with these really beautiful, anywhere from pinkish purple to almost bright electric bluish purple flowers. And sometimes it's season by season. It's not even, 1 year it'll be pinkish, 1 year it'll be a little more blue. And so these are real favorites of bees and hummingbirds and people because of these flowers. They tend to reseed easily in a garden, which is nice because then you get more that pop up. One of the most popular ones that has ever been produced again as a cultivar came from the Las Politas nursery and was introduced by the late Bert Wilson, and that's called Margarita Bop. Bop stands for bottom of porch, where they found this hybrid penstemon growing at the bottom of their porch, and then they introduced it as a cultivar. This one does not get very big. It's a penstemon, a foothill penstemon hybrid, I believe, and it forms kind of a small mound. It's one of the most popular ones, and it can even be found in places like Home Depot and such. So the flowers are very, very incredible. One thing I will note, I have not found them to be very long-lived in any of the gardens that I've planted, and that might be my conditions or something like that, but I found them to be max 2-3 year plants. So I wouldn't use them as a permanent mainstay in your garden, but I would use them intentionally for fast fill. So when you have, say, your toyon shrub, or you have something else that's going to take a little bit longer and it's going to spread out, and you need to fill in some of those empty spaces for a few years, this is going to give you some like incredible flowers for that temporary time, and then naturally probably just kind of like peter out while the other things eventually kind of become more dominant in the landscape. So it's very useful, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it being something that's like 10 years of continuous flowering and good looks, because I have not experienced that myself. And there's also Penstemon centranthifolius with red flowers, which is very cool. So, and other people have said the same about Margarita Bop. George says Antonio Sanchez recommends pinching off the flowers for more blooming. Absolutely, you can do that. On the Margarita Bop, I think specifically maybe on these two, but I probably wouldn't pinch off a flower stalk or anything like that, though you could, while it's young, pinch it off and it would send multiple flower stalks, but they're not always as dominant as the one. So it could be like smaller and slightly less intense. So I usually will leave it alone. One thing I will note on the Penstemon spectabilis with the showy penstemon is that its first habit for the first year, it tends to do this thing where it just goes like, and just flops on the floor, and then the flowers, kind of come up off the floor. Second year, then all the new growth for second year comes off of that floppy, the part that fell over, it comes off of that, and then it becomes like a really rounded and stable plant. So if you see, some people, they'll try to stake it or they'll try to prune it. You could do some tip pruning. While it's really young, you can tip prune it and encourage a little bit more bushiness. But if you miss that window of doing that and you see it fall over, sometimes it's better to just let it be fallen over, because the next year, again, they know what gravity is. They know to go up. And so all the new shoots come off of that branch that's lying down. And then you end up with this like really rounded and very kind of stable plant in year 2. So if you see something funky in year 1, be patient. That's just something they sometimes do. So now we're in the grasses, or the grass-like. So carex is a sedge, and so these are sometimes used as lawn substitutes. So this is going to be a higher water requiring plant. So usually you have lawn substitutes, you have to treat them a little bit like a lawn. You have to give them more water, a little more care. But they have that longer kind of meadowy look. So if you like that look, or you're interested in that, Carex panza or Carex praegracilis seem to be the most promising. Did I miss one? No, okay. So when you want your drought tolerant grasses though, now this is your clumping, really drought tolerant grass. These are stipas or needle grasses. So our state grass of California is purple needle grass, so Stipa pulchra. And then we also have Stipa cernua, or I think that's how you pronounce it, and then Stipa lepida. And so those are 3 different needle grasses, and they're kind of like purple needle grass is the biggest one, then cernua is slightly a little more graceful, and then you have your lepida, which is actually much smaller. But they all have these kind of spiky-ish seed heads. So in the event that you're dealing with your own garden or a client's garden that has dogs or children that run around a lot, that are manually coming in contact with the plants, these seed heads can get stuck in fur or conceivably up a dog's nose, in an ear, etc. So you want to be careful about where you're planting these. But when it's not a highly trafficked area, they're really, really worth it for the fact that they're super drought tolerant. They're seasonal, so you're going to find that it has an off season. The off season, you cut it down to the ground. That's usually in this, late summer. You can cut it down to the ground, and then it rejuvenates in the cool season. And really high wildlife value. Bunch grasses are very superior to many other species at carbon sequestration. So they actually hold so much carbon in their root mass, and they have really, really extensive roots. And so versus trees that hold it all in their above ground, or not all, but hold so much of it in their above ground structures, when those go away, the kind of carbon sequestration benefit is lost and or re-released in the event of a fire. In the event of bunch grass or grassland scenarios, the fire sweeps through. It takes just the top growth off, but the carbon is still sequestered underground in that root system. So it's a very valuable plant community, and the plants themselves are excellent at erosion control. Have massive wildlife value, and if you leave the dead matter, it's usually good to cut it to rejuvenate it. But if you leave it, you will see birds taking like dead grass blades and making their nests out of it. So all of this kind of feeds into the whole web of life and wildlife. Somebody asked, is it great for drought because of the root structure on the side, a hillside? The root structure is one of the things that makes it capable of withstanding intense drought. Yes, I will say that kind of like deep and really robust root structure is what keeps it from, makes it much more resilient. It can be growing on hillsides and in scenarios where that's also serving an erosion control purpose. Because it does go dormant in the summertime, it doesn't get huge, but keep in mind it's going to have dead matter on it, so it might not be the most like fire safe scenario. But when it is dormant, that's when you can cut it down to the ground and then alleviate that issue. So it is kind of a handy plant for its versatility. So fescues, or festuca is the genus. Fescues are another cool season bunch grass. It's used, there are lots of different kinds, and there's many that are very similar to native kinds that are not native that you'll see all around landscapes. So these are very charming. They're very like clumpy. They look like little fuzzy animals. And so they're really nice to have. They're a cool season. They do perform a little better with some protection from the blazing hot sun. So I would say this is in an inland scenario, something better to plant in morning sun, afternoon shade. And in a scenario where you have bunnies, good luck. So bunnies tend to like this and eat this. Just, know your environment, know if you're right next to a wilderness area. I wouldn't plant it if your wildland is adjacent, but in the middle of the city or anything like that, it's fantastic kind of accent grass, or you can clump lots of them together, and it's really charming to kind of see that those moundy kind of forms. So those are 2 cool season grasses. Now we're going to talk about warm season grasses. So what do I mean by cool season, and what do I mean by warm season? Cool season means it does its active growth during the cooler weather. So the fescues and the stipas push their new growth and they look their greenest during the cool weather. So you're talking about like winter through spring. Now, warm season grasses are, and they're dormant the other time. So warm season grasses are the flip side. When it's cool, that's when they go dormant. So like, you know, a sycamore tree drops its leaves in the winter. It's not actively growing during the winter time. So much like that, we have grasses that turn brown and die, or look like they died. They don't actually die. They go dormant during the winter. So they look brown, they don't look at their best. You cut them back really hard, like to the ground. And then once the weather starts heating up, then they start pushing all this green, lush kind of new growth. And so Bouteloua is a genus of a couple types of warm season grasses that are used as warm season lawn substitutes, or as just accent grasses, meadow grasses. And so Bouteloua gracilis, blue grama grass, and Bouteloua curtipendula, which is the side oats grama. Those are the two Boutelouas that are native to California that will give you the green during the summer. They would appreciate some irrigation throughout that summer. I mean, they can technically grow without it, but they'll look really richer and better and happier if you give them some extra supplemental warm season water. And so because they normally occur mostly in the deserts. Some areas of the desert do receive those, you know, summer monsoons and such. And so they do look their best with a little bit of extra H2O. So here's another warm season grass that graces the driveway of the Theodore Payne headquarters. And so these form a pretty big clump. They're about, I don't know, without the seed heads, maybe 2 feet round, but with the seed heads like 3 to 4 feet almost. Some of the prettiest seed heads on any of our grasses are on the Sporobolus saccaton or alkali saccaton grass. So this is Sporobolus aeroides specifically. There's a Sporobolus wrightii, and that one is just barely native to California, but also just like really big with those incredible seed heads. So this is a really fun one when you want a warm season, kind of looks its best in the middle of summer scenario. If it's going to get some summer irrigation, it's going to be much happier and look much better. And so again, doesn't mean that you're like soaking it, or this is a riparian, you know, species. That's not the case. We're not talking about like intense summer irrigation where you're questioning whether it's even drought tolerant. It's still a low water grass, but it will be, you know, happier with some maybe once a month watering. Somebody asked if we worry about these grasses spreading too rapidly because their seed heads are big and feather-like. So that's a really good point, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because then that can kind of segue into another topic. This grass is not an easy reseeder. I have not seen this reseed much at all, which probably is not a good thing because you want it to do some reseeding. And so this is not an issue. The stipa, which is the needle grasses here, these do reseed quite easily. So they will pop up sometimes in places you don't want, maybe in the crack of a sidewalk or something like that. You might have to do a little bit more management on this one, or remove them and pop them up and give them to your friends because they're, you know, important plants for California. This one doesn't reseed almost ever. I've never seen it. And this one doesn't, again, I haven't seen it. It always is very well behaved. The ones that do reseed to the point that it's a major hazard are the non-native invasive feathergrass. And that's actually related to the needlegrass, the Mexican feathergrass. That one is pretty invasive. But more than that, fountain grass. So fountain grass is a grass that everyone's familiar with, and I think I might want to even stop my share and show you guys. Maybe I'll do that at the end. If there's any time, I'll show you the fountain grass. If you guys have not seen it, most people think, oh, this is native because it's just growing on the side of the road and it's got these beautiful, you know, seed heads, and it seems super drought tolerant. That's actually a plant that was introduced in the landscaping trade from South Africa. South Africa is another Mediterranean type climate, so it's very similar to California, and so they're very compatible as far as their needs, kind of horticulturally and kind of just, with regards to growing conditions and environment. The only trouble is those seeds are incredibly viable, and they pop up everywhere, and they blow for miles and end up in hillsides, and nothing can eat them. Nothing can, there's no wildlife here that keeps their populations at bay, and there's no real diseases that, shorten their lives or reduce populations. So they go unchecked and spread with abandon. So that's something we call an invasive species, just like we talked about the mustard being an invasive species. Fountain grass is that way as well. So this Sporobolus doesn't behave that way at all. In fact, it probably would be better if it did behave a little bit that way, because it's one of our native ones that has a little bit more wildlife value and reason for being here. So this is not a scenario where you should be really worried, but if you're thinking about in maintenance terms in a garden, your needle grasses are going to require maybe a little bit more attention in that regard. So now with succulents and cactus. So that's another misconception about native plants, is that it's all cactus. We've just barely gotten to succulents and cactus now. And of the succulents and cactus, they don't form the majority at all, or even a huge percentage of the plants of California. So succulents and cactus are still really important, and they're really beautiful, and they really provide a lot of value in the California native landscape. But they're not the majority. So the first that we're showing here is the Dudleya. So Dudleya is a type of, or a genus of succulents. They usually grow in coastal California, though there are a couple, species in desert scenarios. And they're really very special and very charming and attractive. They do require good drainage, so they don't want to be pooling in water. So usually found on, cliff sides or somewhere where water doesn't collect. One thing that's really shameful and upsetting, but also kind of redeeming, is these are poached often from California. They're very popular in China. And so people will come fly here to California and steal them. They'll take them, rip them right off the hillsides, put them in boxes and try to ship them back to China. And so these like really rare species of Dudleya are being poached. But there were a couple of very significant busts made of people who were doing that. And quite a few Dudleya or a lot of those Dudleya were able to be returned, and they have kind of like this community of the California native plant supporters, like watchdogs, keeping an eye on things to hope, so that doesn't happen again. But it's sad that people can do something like that they come to another place and just rip stuff from the wild and take it back for sale. The irony is that nurserymen and women in China were saying, this is very easy to grow. Like, why are you even going to California to do that? We can grow it here. And so hopefully there's a culture shift and people are realizing that it's not hard to grow this, and they'll start growing their own instead of poaching it. Oh, somebody asked about deergrass. That's funny that it's not on this list. Yes, deergrass is another large evergreen, but I would say, yeah, it's technically evergreen grass. Really big, like a big 3 to 4 foot grass. It's very attractive. One thing I will state about it is I feel like it's overused in really dry gardens. It would much more appreciate being in either semi-moist or seasonally wet scenarios. So if you have a rain garden, it would love to be like in the depression of a rain garden, where it'll pool up, it'll kind of flood, but then the other time of the year it'll be dry. A lot of people will put them in like desert scapes, and that's really not what they should be in, and they tend to look more brown and less attractive than they normally would be in their, in the right kind of condition. So just be aware, like don't overuse it in like a super dry, hot scenario. If it's going to be hot and dry, make sure it's getting a little more water. It appreciates more water than most people give it. So agave is something that's planted a lot in California. One of the photos that was shared as part of homework featured an agave, but it wasn't a native agave. So keep that in mind, that most agaves that are planted in people's homes and landscapes are, I think, either Central or South American agave species. We do have a few. We have a desert agave, and then we have this really rare, kind of threatened Baja agave Shai. And so this one's really cool. Theodore Payne has a bunch of clusters of it on their hillside. And so this one is threatened. It really kind of only exists in one more isolated area. And opuntias. Opuntias are the prickly pear cactus that we talked about already. Really showy, really drought tolerant. They spread and they kind of create this whole colony wherever they are. I planted some for a client in Van Nuys, and we started in 1-gallon pots, and now it's a, I don't know, 8-foot wide mass of prickly pear. So it's actually too much for that client. And so I advised him to take barbecue tongs and just break off whichever sections he doesn't want, and then put it in a bucket, put it out on his sidewalk, and anyone who wants to take it can take it. Because the cool thing about cacti and succulents really, but cacti is very easy to kind of just propagate. And so once you allow that wound from breaking off, say, a pad, once it calluses, meaning it's not so fresh and juicy anymore, it calluses, gets a little hardened, then you can either just like stick it on the soil or even just lay it down somewhere, and it just will root in place. So I had some beaver tail cactus pads that I left on soil, and I was like, I'll pot you up someday, and I forgot to pot it up. Then I saw it start to grow from the pad itself, which was just lying down on the soil, and it had rooted through the mid part of the pad. It wasn't even that I like stuck it the way that it, should kind of look. It was just like laying down. So they will just find a spot and root. So they're very easy to propagate and easy to share that way as well. Are these good for bank stabilization? Well, they're grown a lot naturally on hillsides. So it really depends on the situation. So I would say, yes, erosion control, they're probably excellent, but also they're heavy. So that's something to keep in mind. So a lot of people, for instance, use ice plant. Not a native, okay? Ice plant is another invasive species, but they'll use it in beaches because they say, oh, it's good for erosion control. It's actually not. It actually slides. It has very shallow root system and it slides with the sand, and that's how it recolonizes new environments. So it's actually very poor at erosion control. Cacti don't have shallow, or opuntias don't have shallow root systems. They have deeper root systems, and I would say they would probably be very good at bank stabilization. But I would still keep in mind what kind of soil type you're using, or what kind of soil conditions are there, because they're heavy. They have a lot of water content. They're heavier plants than some other species. So just use your judgment. All right, now for the trees. So oaks, one of the best species for generating good quality habitat. The leaves on the oak trees support, I forgot how many, 175 or more species of butterfly and moth caterpillar. So it's a host plant for tons of butterflies and moths. That fact alone means that it is the food web chain is started from those caterpillars. So if you think about, I don't want caterpillars on my plants, you actually require high insect populations on your plants. If you love birds, if you love all other higher animals, you want to start with having plants that attract and support lots of different species of insects. So caterpillars are fantastic because they're baby bird food. If you like songbirds, you have to like and support habitat for caterpillars, meaning for the babies of butterflies and moths. And so that's one thing that I tell people in classes that are not where people don't already love native plants is you love butterflies and you love birds, but you kill the caterpillars on plants. It's completely the opposite of what you want to do. And so the oak trees support tons of caterpillar species, which means tons of bird species, and then every other insects that eat and parasitize and rely on caterpillars and other insects. So you have the whole food chain. Plus, they produce the acorns that feed birds, that feed small mammals, that feed deer, and so everything from the tiniest insect to a mountain lion. And I'll say a mountain lion because mountain lions subsist on deer. And other animals that subsist on acorns and rely on them during the fall. Everything is touched by an oak tree. And so if all you did was have an oak tree with a mulch floor, you would support more life than conceivably a whole native garden that didn't have an oak tree. So as far as like number of species supported. So just think about that when you have an option to put a tree. Think about really maximizing the habitat value and considering an oak tree within reason, of course. If you have a very, very small space, these are going to get big. These are big trees. You could find smaller trees. You could do a scrub oak. You could do a blue oak, though the likelihood of finding it in a nursery is very slim. So you could find smaller oak trees if you want kind of that same benefit without the big footprint. Valley oak is your biggest oak. So if you want the most majestic kind of sized, fastest growing oak, a valley oak is kind of the way to go. But these will be, as far as wildlife value, your best bet. And yes, keep in mind, fusarium is a fungal disease that's affecting our oaks via the shot hole borer. The good thing about the coast live oak is that it's relatively immune. The shot hole borer only attacks the limbs and not the main trunk of the coast live oak. So if you want something that's going to be the most, I would say, immune, I would go with the coast live oak. The valley oak, unfortunately, is less so. So Parkinsonia, that's a tree in the background. In the foreground, you can see showy penstemon again, which is lovely. But Parkinsonia is the Palo Verde, and the most common cultivar is this almost three-way hybrid called Desert Museum. And so that Desert Museum is the one that you're going to see most often in the nursery trade, though the one that you're seeing in this photo right here is the straight species, just the Parkinsonia florida. And so it has bright yellow flowers, green trunks. The trunks photosynthesize. It's fantastic. As far as, wildlife value, it's not as high up there as an oak tree, but it usually is better for slightly smaller spaces. Definitely good for that desert landscape feel. And obviously for people who absolutely adore yellow flowers, this is kind of a no-brainer. So smaller, very large, I would say, shrub to small tree is the Western redbud. Western redbud's really charming for the fact that it has these pink flowers that occur in the winter time. So like my Western redbud is just about to bloom and it's, February. And so the thing with the Western redbuds and many of our trees that kind of have a dormancy, winter dormant period, is they kind of require cooler temperature. In this case, they like the really cold winters. So if you live on the coast, they may never really quite bloom as much. They might not entirely go dormant. They don't know the season. So where they want to be is somewhere where like the seasons are really obvious. Like it's really cold in the winter. Maybe it snows even. It's really cold in the winter and then it's really warm in the summer. And, so it really triggers this like massive simultaneous blooming and you get a better kind of look from the plant based on that. If you're too coastal, the temperatures are too mild, there isn't as sharp a differentiation between winter and summer, you might get an underperforming Western redbud. And conversely, or not conversely, but on the same flip side of that, the desert willow. So the desert willow is massively adaptable, really attractive. The flowers are large, almost tropically looking. They're really attractive to hummingbirds. And same thing, if you plant it in the coast, it doesn't quite know what to do or when to go dormant as easily as if you plant it in a scenario where the summers are really, really obviously hot. And so if the summers are really hot and the winters the summer is more important than the winter in the case of this species. The summers have got to be hot. So if you've got mild summers, you're going to get a really lackluster bloom. But if you get really blistering hot sun, and especially if you give it like a monthly deep soak, you're going to get blooms on this thing for months and months and months in the middle of the hottest time of the year. It's like the hotter it is, the happier it is, the more it blooms, the more kind of showy it is. And so it's one of those really great ones for tough scenarios. It's a really good one for in my opinion, for cases where you're doing like a street tree with a lot of radiating heat off of the asphalt roads and the sidewalks. And there was even, it might have just been an Instagram post from the executive director of Theodore Payne, but like one that was growing from a seedling in a crack in the sidewalk in like the hottest part of Sun Valley, and it was blooming and it was so happy. So it's one of those for those really harsh conditions. It has a light shade, which is actually, if you ever see it kind of undulating, it produces one of the most psychedelic and beautiful patterns of shadows on the ground that I've ever seen. It's very beautiful. It's a light shade though, so if you're thinking like, I need a shade tree to really cool off my house, or it's not necessarily going to give you that level of shade, but that's neither here nor there. Somebody asks if you do a monthly deep soak for it all year round or just leading up to the bloom. I would say through the hottest time of the year. So the opposite of what you would do for a manzanita or a ceanothus. This is something you'll do, say, from like May through September, give it a nice deep soak. And oh yes, and somebody referenced a good tree to put in the basin of a rain garden. So that's the other thing I want to make sure that you guys think about is, where does this plant occur in the wild? So in nature, these plants occur in desert washes. A desert wash is an area where obviously it's super hot, it's a desert, but when it rains, that's where the water pools and collects. So this is a really excellent plant to plant in the basin of a rain garden. Anywhere where it floods seasonally is good for it. So again, not all plants can tolerate that, and this one is one of those that not only tolerates it, but actually thrives and does really well. And if you can see, I don't know if it's very evident, but this is the desert willow that's at the Theodore Payne sales yard. This is a rain garden right here, and it's kind of right in the rain garden. All right, so vines are one of those things that when I worked in the Theodore Payne nursery, everybody wanted native vines, and there aren't that many. But the ones that there are, we have our native morning glories. And so there's a few different varieties, and the most showy one is going to be your island morning glory. And in particular, the cultivar called Anacapa Pink is probably going to be the one that kind of like covers a fence line the most quickly and looks the most, charming and really kind of gives you a full coverage pretty quickly. So that one is Anacapa Pink Morning Glory. And, it's perfect for those scenarios where you would use that conventional, I don't know if it's Japanese Morning Glory or the one with the purple blue flowers that's kind of invasive. This one is a good replacement for that. So Aristolochia is Dutchman's pipe. This one is a unique one that takes a little more water and is a host plant for a particular butterfly, but I don't remember which one. And then there's honeysuckle. So the honeysuckle is one of those that is not entirely a vine. And so it's used a lot in a vine. You can train it as a vine, but it's really more like a climbing shrub. And so you'll find it clambering up into other shrubs and kind of vining its way up, but it's not kind of conventional vine. And so you'll have to do some training. So if you decide to use this as a vine, you'll have to do a little bit of training. Otherwise, you can let it do its natural thing, which is just to be more sprawling and kind of clamber onto other neighboring shrubs. But it's not the, again, I'm going to say Japanese honeysuckle because I think that's what it is, but it's not the same one as that. That one's also semi-invasive, but also just really kind of more aggressive. Oh yes, Jess Chang says the pipe vine swallowtail is the butterfly that you're supporting by planting Dutchman's pipe. And to that, make sure that you are aware that, you know, butterflies have certain ranges as well. So just because you plant something that's a host for a particular butterfly doesn't mean the butterfly is ever going to find it. If, say, the butterfly is only in Central California and you plant this plant in Southern California, don't be like, I'm looking for the pipe vines or pipe vine swallowtails. Sometimes they have a bigger range and you will get that, but other times, you know, be aware that butterflies have a particular territory. And yes, the CalScape is a really good resource for you, and I'll actually maybe pop it up a little bit later when we do our activities, so you can search by zip code what plants would do well based on, you know, your location. So this is where I would definitely go for, as far as like vines, the vitis or our native grapevines are going to be probably your most useful. Just keep in mind that the grape goes dormant in the winter time. There is a cultivar called Rogers Red that you're looking at that turns bright red in the fall, which is really beautiful. It's also a very aggressive grower, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in like just, it's very robust. It'll cover things really quickly. It produces fruit. So these are native grapes. They produce small purple, slightly more sour seeded grapes. They are edible, but not going to be like your conventional table grapes. I have made things out of it personally. It's very grapey and a little more tart. So just keep that in mind, but the birds will love it regardless. And that's usually why people, you know, plant that. Yeah, in the spring and summer, somebody remarked that, you know, it's dead in winter. All you're seeing is the branches, but it practically grows overnight in the spring and summer. So that level of like, it just pushes that new growth really quickly is one of its good values as far as coverage, covering a fence line, or just giving you that green or red in this case. Is that it? Oh, cool. All right. So now we have a couple exercises, if we're okay on time. We're not okay on time. All right, so it's 8 o'clock, everyone. So maybe this can be a at-home exercise for you to do. I do want to give you a quick overview about the flashcards, though. So some of you have not been able to pick up your flashcards. That is okay, because you can, instead of, number one, you can certainly get the flashcards during the workshop. If you are planning on attending the workshop, just let me know so that I make sure I have the flashcards on me and you can have this, because this is part of your class and you get it for free. The other thing is, let's see. You can do some of this. I'm going to stop the share and then share a different screen. Oh, I thought I was going to share a different screen. Okay, let's share this screen. You can go to CalScape. In lieu of doing the flashcards, you can always go to CalScape and you can look up plants by name. You can look up plants by address, and you can do an advanced search just like this. So for instance, if I was to ask you to use the flashcards to find me 3 plants that take low water or lowest water needs, full sun, and need fast draining soil, you can use your flashcards to do that, or you can go to this website and you go, oh, okay, I want full sun, was it fast draining soil, and let's do low, maybe low and very low, and let's search for plants. Oh, the Dudleya, the fuchsia, and the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. That's my answer to there. You know, so you have this resource and option. But I do want to show you this card. And if you want to maybe pin my screen or something. So these are the flashcards. These are going to have plant profiles of all sorts of different native plants. The one thing I do need to point out to you, because it can be a little bit confusing, is on the third, there's the title sheet, the second one, and the third one. You will see reading the plant cards, a key for how to read the plant cards. Under the sun portion, it shows full sun is more than 6 hours a day, part sun is like less than 6 hours a day, and then a blacked out sun, which means shade. This is all in black ink. On the cards, it's in white ink. And so what is actually a full shade is a bright white sun. What is full sun is just the white is the sun's rays and the middle is like darker. So it can look really confusing as long as you use this key, and just keep in mind that what's black on the key is white on the cards. Then you'll know what's full sun, what's shade. But if you just look at the one and you don't look at the key, it looks like the one that says it's full sun is actually full shade, and the one that says it's full shade is full sun. It's not intuitive, and so that's just like a little bit of a design concern that I had, and I just don't want you to be confused about it. So please use the key, and please know that the key is in black, the actual cards are in white, and model it after the key, knowing that whatever is black is white on this card. So you can do this activity on your own, either right after this class or at home, or use it as a part of your homework. But basically all we want to do is sort some of the flashcards by similar needs. And so you can just think, okay, I want plants that are for full shade, that take high water and are adaptable, have an adaptable soil type. And then just like find a few plants that can do that. You can use your flashcards as your guide on a site property. So you're here, I'm under an oak tree, the soil's well draining, but there's like no sun, and I'm planning on not watering it because it's under an oak tree. Not watering it, but keeping it drought tolerant after it's established. So I'm going to look for the plants that have the in this case whited out sun symbol, only the one droplet of water, and the word maybe adaptable or fast draining, depending on what soil type you have. So then you can just search for plants that work that way. You can also use Calscape. So you have lots of online resources. You can use the Theodore Payne database. You can use lascolitas.com. There are lots of resources listed in your student handbook. So feel free to use those websites as well. And then we're not going to do this because we don't have time, but think about some alternatives to certain trees or shrubs or perennials that maybe are conventionally used in landscapes that are non-native, and you have like a native substitute. So if you want to think about this, you can email me it as homework. You can just think about it and have it ready for next class. But for instance, Australian willows, everyone's planting Australian willows. Why not a desert willow? That seems pretty no-brainer. One shrub, oleanders to toyons would be much better. Mexican sage to Cleveland sage. Creeping acacia or whatever that kind of big bank stabilizing ground cover is to pigeon point coyote brush, etc. So start thinking about those kinds of alternatives. And so to give you your homework, again, you can email this to, actually, I don't know if you need to email this, or if we just, email it to me. Observe a few mature native plants. So you can do this in either clients' gardens, your own garden. You can go to a botanical garden. You can go to Theodore Payne and just wander their grounds. It's free. You don't have to pay to just look at the plants. And so think about How old is it by sight? Can you tell if this is newly planted, really mature, really old, and it's falling apart? How old is it? What size is it? Is it 8 feet tall, etc.? Do you know if it's full size? So if you know what plant it is, you can look up on CalScape, you can look up on Theodore Payne's database and see how big it's supposed to get, and determine whether it's full size or not. Is it flowering? Does it need maintenance? If you're noticing, hey, it's got like 20 dead branches on it, it really could use some maintenance, or it's in its off season and it hasn't been cut back yet. Make note of that. And then how is it managed? Is it managed? This is a little bit more of like a deep dive into a specific plant and making those kinds of observations. So go ahead and do that between now and Tuesday. You can send me an email of it. If you don't get around to sending me an email, but you keep the information, we can chat about it at the start of the class. And if you notice anything interesting or weird, or you have questions about maybe discrepancies in different resources for the information you're seeing, bring those up. So different resources come from different parts of California. You have, Las Politas, who works out of Santa Margarita, and they'll say one thing about a plant because that's the way it performs there. But Theodore Payne has a totally different, approach, or their experience is different based on where they are. So this is a little bit about, talking about the resources and talking about observations and what you're seeing in gardens. So that's your lesson 2. Next class will be lesson 3, the workshop about soils. And so here are some resources also. These are also on your in your student handbook, but this is our final page for our for our lesson. So we'll do a kind of a dive into soils next Tuesday. If anyone has any further questions, I can linger for a few more minutes. Otherwise, thank you all for being so patient. Sorry we keep going over. This one was probably the one with the most number of slides, so hopefully the others will not go over and we can actually maybe leave slightly early. Who knows? So thank you, everyone.